This is the Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Ecott, and you're listening to In Conversation. The Arab Spring has brought about huge changes in the political and social landscape of the Middle East. Religious divisions and the rise of rival Islamist factions have fragmented societies like Egypt and Syria, but the plight of the ancient Christian sects within the Middle East has largely been ignored. Reports from Egypt indicate that life for Coptic Christians has become particularly difficult. They form the largest group of Christians in the Arab world. Bishop Angaelos was born in Cairo and is from the Coptic Orthodox Church, but is now based in Britain. I asked him what he knew of the plight of Christians in the Middle East in the light of the ongoing political upheavals.
Dealing specifically with Egypt, I think the past decades, if I can start, they have been quite tough. We've seen an increased division within the community and the polarisation between Christians and Muslims. Now, many in retrospect will say that was potentially a weapon of the government, a tool of the government to divide and conquer communities.
You're saying that's going back quite some time. I mean, even in the Mubarak era, when people outside Egypt assumed that Christians were living side by side with the other communities, you're saying that even then there were problems.
It started actually with Sadat, who actually went on a rampage and held our own pope under house arrest for months. Then we went into Mubarak era, it was a stalemate, and I think there was the use of the Brotherhood as a tool, saying they will come back if we don't have a stronghold and they will attack Christians. Then with the uprising in 2011, we saw a very hopeful picture, although I was one of the skeptics, I must say, unfortunately, because I thought it was premature, it was cosmetic. There wasn't the infrastructure or the insight to carry on the uprising, and there wasn't the presence to actually lead the country. So it was quite a headless revolution. And that's why we had a political vacuum for a while, and the Muslim Brotherhood then jumped on to the situation.
With the emergence of the Brotherhood, did you personally have fears that were they to win, as they eventually did in an election, that would bring specific problems for the Christian community?
And there weren't fears, there were concerns, and I, along with many, knew that would happen. The surprise was I thought that would happen probably towards the end of the first term of presidency, maybe in the second term, because I thought they would be able to play the game for a bit longer and maybe present a picture of trying to incorporate and encompass the community. Whereas actually, it's not what we found. We found that there was a power grab within the first 12 months. The real concern wasn't for the community, it was for the Muslim Brotherhood and the Freedom and Justice Party. And we found the president, the then president, Morsi, directed very much by the Freedom and Justice Party and by the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood. There are 2 points to make there. The first was that a lot of people said that there was corruption in the elections. There was a lot of abuse of a vulnerable electorate that was predominantly poor and illiterate. But even with that, and with the fact that many of the people who voted against Shafi, who was then seen to be ex-Mubarak, and many abstained, the actual majority was about 0.7%. So it was very fragile anyway. What we saw after that was that there was this power grab, there were lots of promises. There was a promise that there was going to be a Christian vice president and a woman vice president. Obviously that never came about, and it was because the Islamists said to Morsi then, no, you're not, because we can't be under the rule of neither a woman nor a Christian.
Can you paint us a picture of what you were hearing about how Copts were faring specifically once the Muslim Brotherhood took power? I mean, were these attacks? Was it a feeling of a lack of safety? Was it a lack of willingness to listen to the Christian viewpoint? I mean, what were Egyptian Christians reporting?
Well, I think as part of the wider Egyptian community, we all wanted to be hopeful. Although only weeks after the elections and the uprising, we saw attacks on churches. We had deaths in those 2 years since the uprising, deaths of Christians just for being Christians, greater than the 20 years that preceded that. We saw an increased presence of lawlessness and attacks on Christians and communities that culminated finally in the attack on our cathedral in Cairo. That was unprecedented. It's never happened, even during the Islamic invasion of Egypt. It never happened in those centuries. And the Coptic Christians in Egypt are the greatest denomination numbers-wise in the Middle East. And so this was quite a significant strike.
Tell us about what you know specifically about what happened to the cathedral.
In Upper Egypt, there was a clash. Muslims attacked Christians there and killed a number of them because they said that young boys had drawn religious graffiti on the neighboring Islamic school. It turned out they were actually Muslim boys who drew a swastika that wasn't even a cross. Because of the heated nature of the situation there, it was thought that the funerals were better to be held in Cairo, away from this village, so it wouldn't cause more trouble. The funerals were held in the cathedral because of the number of people there. As people left, obviously they were very emotional. Islamist supporters had gathered outside the cathedral to clash with people who were coming out who were mourning their dead. And they started to effectively attack the cathedral with Molotov cocktails, with weapons. We've got photographs and footage of all of this in plain sight of then the police, who did absolutely nothing. There was a Bible burnt in view of police officers, although there was this whole law of religious symbols that had come into place, and nothing was done.
There's been a lot of soul-searching, hasn't there, on the part of Egyptians and particularly outside powers, particularly Western nations like the USA and Britain, looking at Egypt and saying, well, we thought that overthrowing Mubarak and a military-backed regime was a good thing. It seemed like democracy was on its way to Egypt. But now we have a situation where another uprising has thrown out the Muslim Brotherhood, albeit again with some form of military backing. Where do you think the Christian community would have stood in all of this, though? Do you think that they would have been key players in fomenting opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood based on their experiences?
I think that Christians, by and large, have been very good citizens and very, very productive and proactive citizens. I think what we saw on the 30th of June with that second uprising was, once again, like in 2011, you couldn't distinguish between Christian and Muslim unless they were visibly attired.
Have you any evidence that tensions between the Muslims and Christians in Egypt has lessened since the Brotherhood was removed?
Absolutely. There's a very different spirit in Egypt now. I think people are much more hopeful. I am much more hopeful than I was in 2011 because I think this is no longer cosmetic. The Muslim Brotherhood for decades had flagged itself up as the only savior, and their slogan was, Islam is the solution. And so a lot of people actually saw that they were the only solution because they were the only alternative. Having them come in and then discredit themselves and having been removed in 12 months, I think has taken that theory off the table.
Will there not be, though, a simmering resentment on the part of some Muslims that they seemingly had won a legitimate vote to govern the country? They've been removed with some degree of force. Will some Muslims, in your view, perhaps potentially blame Christians, though, for whatever happens next?
Oh, of course. And that's why after the gatherings of the Muslim Brotherhood in Cairo were dispersed last month, there were those attacks on 50 churches in the space of 48 hours. But also, people wanted the Christians to retaliate and therefore to create a spiral of violence and lead into this civil war that people have been speaking about. Although that would never happen in Egypt. Egypt is not...
Some Egyptians, though, when we put this question to them, analysts and people involved in politics in Egypt, though, they deny that there is a religious element to the conflict. I mean, what is the Christian population? It's relatively small proportionally, isn't it?
Well, the Christian population is about 15 to 20% of Egypt, regardless of what some of the government statistics might say. And yes, I agree that the current situation is not Christian-Muslim. It is Islamist against the rest of the community.
Would you be hopeful, or would you hope for some kind of guarantee of religious freedom by whichever government next comes into power in Egypt?
I would hope for a guarantee of the respect of human rights across the board. Because it's not just Christians who suffered under the Morsi era. It was Shiite Muslims who were dragged out in the street and mercilessly killed just because they were Shiites. The Baha'is were completely ignored. Secularists were demonized. So if a country is going to move ahead, I would rather religion not play any part at all in the dynamics of the constitution. I've always said that religion must be a moral compass that directs politics, but it should not set politics or influence those politics directly. And that is because every person that is seen is equal.
Just finally on the plight or the situation of Egyptian Christians or Christians in Egypt, what can the church do, if anything, either at the governmental level or the international level or at the community level to muster its resources to protect its own community? Can it do anything?
Well, the first thing the church has done over the past months, and I think that has been a great asset, is to call for restraint and to call people to peaceful resolution and reconciliation. Because it is actually very counterintuitive to have that many churches burnt down. And within our context in Egypt, I suppose it's very similar to Russia or many other majority Orthodox countries where churches are an extension of people's homes. So this was a very personal attack on people. Yet there wasn't a single incident of retaliation or revenge. Secondly, we have tried to protect people by curtailing public gatherings that were unnecessary. So our liturgies went on, but large gatherings like the Pope's weekly sermon in Cairo stopped for months. The first one was only last week, because that gathers about 7,000 people. I think what the church is doing is telling its people to still live as Christians and be faithful and to be confident. What we are doing here as a church is to raise awareness, because the coverage in Western media has been appalling in some sectors. With all of these churches being burnt down, not a single word.
Why do you think that is?
I think there was a preoccupation with putting labels on things. Was this a military coup or was it not a military coup? I have no doubt that there was a very large Muslim Brotherhood machine working in the background to inform media sources and to move certain Western politicians. But when the reality of the ugliness of what was happening was revealed, people saw that Christians were attacked by Islamists and probably by Muslim Brotherhood once the investigations come through.
There's an irony there, isn't there? Because the West is often self-defined as a loosely Christian civilization or culture, whichever Western country you tend to talk about. They think of Christianity as the basis of that society, at least historically and morally. And yet you seem to be implying that the Western media did not pick up on the plight of those 20% of Egyptians who were suffering specifically because they were Christian.
Absolutely. What was even more ironic was that the Muslim Brotherhood, that had always accused Christians in Egypt of being Western Zionist sympathizers and calling on Western powers to protect them, once they felt they were going to be compromised, they're the first ones who called on the West to come and protect them. They wanted boots on the ground. And they also started to go to Western media as their saviors. We had ridiculous things being said on Western media, like the fact that there was a makeshift field hospital in the center of Cairo. This is one of the most affluent, leafy suburbs of Egypt. They wanted to conjure up images of Syria, of mass killings. But of course, all eyes have now been shifted to Syria, and people don't talk about Muslim Brotherhood or about Egypt anymore. So even putting all those eggs in that one basket didn't help anyone.
Well, I suppose there's probably, it would be fair to say, an assumption on the part of Western journalists, unless they're intimately connected with the region, to assume that affairs in the Middle East are predominantly Muslim affairs. What are you hearing, Bishop Angaelos, about the plight of Christians in Syria?
What's happening in Syria now is affecting the whole community, Christians and Muslims. But we've also recently seen an attack on a predominantly Christian village. And we've seen the abduction of 2 Orthodox bishops who are yet to be found. That in itself, I think, has really brought a lot of suffering.
And what sort of numbers of Christians were there in Syria before the civil war?
I don't know the numbers, but I am hearing that a significant number has actually fled at the moment. I think at the beginning, with the first uprising in Syria, the church then was perceived to have spoken for the Assad regime. And so therefore it is being attacked more rigorously in certain parts as a reaction to that.
Have you any evidence that the church and the Assad government were intimate or close or in support of one another?
The situation in Syria is very similar to the situation in Egypt. Whether it was the Assad regime or the Mubarak regime, it was all anyone had. It was either that or Islamist attack. And so churches dealt with the governments in place. Were they completely accepting everything they did? Of course not.
But Christians were able to go about their business and Christian churches were able to operate, as far as you're aware, in Syria freely.
They were back then. And I think that was their fear when they saw an Islamist move on power. They thought that this would be challenged right at the outset. But obviously now the dynamics have changed considerably. And I think everyone is at risk of losing quite a lot if some sort of movement towards reconciliation doesn't happen.
Why do you think the plight of Christians in the Middle East generally has received so little attention? Is the Christian church bad at PR?
As Coptic Christians, we haven't really been accustomed to crying out for help. And so we would have to rely on others seeing the need. And I think, unfortunately, the world being what it is, people are busy doing their own things and affected by their own situations. We have heard significant voices, and we're very thankful for those voices. But having lived in these dynamics for 1400 years, we're not ones who will be calling out for much help.
Is there, though, any sort of concrete charitable effort or ecumenical effort on the part of Christian churches generally to support Christians in places like Syria right now?
I was just speaking to General Secretary of Churches Together in England, which is our ecumenical body here in England. We've just issued a letter of support to Pope Tewodros and the Coptic Church in Egypt, as we also will be issuing those same letters to leaders of the Christian communities in Syria. I also know that there is a lot of humanitarian aid that has been given by churches and quite thankfully received.
And is that directed specifically, if we're talking about Syria, to Christian communities?
It tends to deal with areas, and if those areas have Muslims within them, then they're also used for those.
Quite a number of Syrians have lamented that they fear that one of the consequences of the civil war will be the fact that religion will probably become a more significant part of how Syria is run. That up until now, whatever the rights and wrongs of Assad's regime, as you call it, the different faiths have been able to coexist alongside one another. Are you hearing that sort of fear?
Of course. I think if the resistance continues, then of course there is a much more Islamic angle put on the whole situation, whereas this really wasn't about religion to start with, because I feel that a lot of it is politics. And once you start to put an Islamic spin from one side, then obviously it means that the Christians are on the polar opposite of that picture. And that in itself creates an unhealthy dynamic. Whereas I think people should look at things for what they are. They are political issues. I don't see the resistance in Syria making claims that there have been particular attacks on just Muslims, but they want to topple a government. I'm a firm believer that countries should govern themselves. And if we are going to help in any way, now speaking from the British context, I think we should help people to sit around the table and talk about resolutions rather than letting them put this religious spin on things and overcomplicating them. Because once we say we're going to intervene militarily, then again, we're playing into the Western crusader rhetoric that is coming in to attack Muslims. And that is not the case at all.
There is much agonized debate in Western nations, notably Britain, America, France, about which, if any, of the rebel groups they should be supporting. Do you feel that if any of these Western governments do go in on any level, that somebody should be making sure that one of the conditions of that intervention would be some kind of guarantee of religious freedom?
I'm praying with all my being that this intervention, of course, is not military. That will not be productive in any sense.
Well, military or political, even if it's a case of seeing a transitional government put in, if it comes to that.
Exactly. If it's political or diplomatic, then of course it must safeguard everyone's freedom, whether it be religious minorities, women, children. So as you rightly pointed out, and as I confirm, this is no longer just about Christians and Muslims, and especially with Syria being such a diverse community. There are so many different players and so many different factors to bring into place that any sense of reconciliation is going to take a lot of work. And if any of these elements are not brought into the reconciliation, there will continue to be that divisive element that will undermine everything. So I think there needs to be a safeguarding of people's human rights.
You mentioned that in historical terms, we're talking hundreds, if not thousands of years, the relationship between the Christian church in these predominantly now Muslim countries has seen its ups and downs. Do you have any sense, though, that now is a particularly difficult time to be Christian in the Middle East?
It is becoming more difficult because numbers and proportions are dropping. And also because we are seeing such a presence now of political Islam that is completely unaccepting of the presence of anyone else. And so, of course...
And you would differentiate what you're calling political Islam from Islam, the religion?
I am differentiating the approach of political Islam from most Muslims I know, who do not want to discriminate, who do not want to alienate anyone, who do want to live in a country that respects them, and a region that respects them, but also respects their Christian or any other neighbors. And I think, as we've seen in Egypt and as we're seeing in Syria, as I said, people are being affected generally. It's not just Christians or Muslims. So now there is an idea that communities must stand together. And there must be moved towards the smaller communities, as you say, so that if we see a small Christian community or a small Shiite community or a small Baha'i community, we need to encompass those into the general life of the country, whether it be Egypt or anywhere else. Otherwise, they will continue to suffer. And as human beings, we can't stand by and see anyone suffer. I feel great pain for anyone who's suffering in the Middle East or anywhere in the world. And so I think our humanity draws us to feeling compassion and empathy and sympathy.
That's obviously the general, if you don't mind me saying, Christian view of the world anyway. But, I mean, you must acknowledge that there are forces at work now within Islam that seem to be putting Christianity, not just in the Middle East, under pressure.
Of course, absolutely. And that's why I make the distinction between Muslims and Islamists. And as I said earlier, they are very, very unaccepting of even their presence. They marginalize, they alienate, they would want to eradicate. We heard a lot of hate speech in the recent demonstrations in Cairo.
These religious symbols that you touched upon there, I mean, they're even becoming a factor in a country like Britain. I mean, right now there seems to be a big public debate and even at governmental level debate about the wearing of the veil, for example. How do you see that developing as an argument? Where do you stand on whether people should regard a symbol of their religion as something that they must adhere to at all costs, even if they're a relatively small group within a larger society?
I think every country is governed by its own laws, and people make a proactive and educated decision to live within a certain nation. So whatever the rules of that nation are, then we must abide by them. But at the same time, those rules need to be sympathetic and understanding of culture. I don't see that we can tell Muslim women not to wear a veil, a headscarf in the street. The veil is very different. The veil in terms of security, in terms of confirming someone's identity, I think that's very essential. So in things like court appearances or going through security checkpoints or examinations where you have to be sure of who the person is, then surely you can't be wearing a veil. But to wear a headscarf...
You wouldn't accept a religious argument for allowing people to remain covered at all costs?
Well, we know that a few years ago there was a horrific murder of a police constable, and the person who killed her left the country dressed in a full niqab with his sister's passport. In Egypt, for instance, what I have seen is when women are veiled completely, there is a female officer who is there, who exposes the face and sees their face and recognizes them. Of course, we must protect people's modesty. If a woman feels this is part of her modesty and part of her religious life, she should not be compromised.
But where do you draw the line? Do you say they must not be compromised in schools? Do you think Muslim schools Islamic schools should be allowed to set the rules and say you must walk to school wearing the niqab as they deem it necessary for a Muslim woman to dress that way?
I think there's a difference between a school uniform and a religious symbol, as you say. If the niqab is going to be seen as a uniform, then it's not a religious symbol. But if you're going to say it's a religious symbol, you can't impose it on every pupil. So if they have a school uniform, they wear the school uniform. But if it's a matter of presence, some parents would not want their children to be dressed that way.
Do you have much contact with Islamic leaders? Do you discuss these sorts of things?
Some of the roles I have here in England are also interreligious. So I'm a scholar consultant on the Christian Muslim Forum. So I have regular contact with my friends on the forum and leaders and also grassroots Muslims, as well as my own relationships with Muslims who I know through various other things I do. And I'm also a moderator of the Church's Interreligious Network, which brings together the interreligious officers of all the Christian churches across the 4 nations through Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. So I deal quite extensively with interreligious matters. And yes, we do discuss these matters. And we discuss
presumably the rise of what the press would call radicalism is an issue that you must talk about.
It is, because I think it actually endangers Muslim communities more significantly than it does wider communities. It impacts them directly, but then they are tainted by what happens as well. So I think there needs to be a dealing with these issues for the interests of the Muslim communities themselves.
You can't speak for them, obviously, but in your ecumenical discussions, are you aware that there is a fear that this mixing up of the terms Islamist and Islamic is becoming harder to disentangle?
It is, because I think people will use these terms politically as well sometimes. Islamists will not necessarily call themselves Islamists. But I think we need to see and assess matters for what they are. If people are being destructive and exclusive, then that can't be supported and it can't be left unchecked.
Do you feel that the Western media needs to pay more attention to the plight of Christians in places like Syria right now, or are they best left fending for themselves?
I know what I'm going to say is probably potentially controversial, but I think media as a whole needs to focus on reporting news and issues rather than directing public opinion. And
How do they do that?
I think what I saw from many news agencies over that period, that there was a real push to get sympathy for people who were demonstrating as the Muslim Brotherhood, as those who were followers of a deposed democratically elected leader, while not listening to the voices of Egypt itself. The vast majority of Egyptians were saying, listen, this is what we want. Yet, as I said, with rhetoric like makeshift field hospitals and rhetoric that refers to civil wars, and I think a very different picture. And if you're sitting here in England seeing that, you really can't distinguish them between Egypt and Syria, or Egypt and Iraq, or Egypt and Libya, whereas the dynamics are very different in all of those. So I think the picture painted was at best misinformed, at worst manipulative.
We've talked about Syria in detail, but finally, do you have any evidence that Christians within Egypt, if they're capable of leaving, are they leaving because of what they fear may happen, or because of the things that have happened?
A year ago, yes, Christians were leaving, but it wasn't just Christians. Anyone who had the means to leave was leaving to set up an exit strategy. They were going to set up a business somewhere, or buy a property somewhere, or put their children in schools, because it was a very uncertain time. So Christians and Muslims who were in that financial position where they could do that were setting up a plan B. But Christians alone, no. I mean, we as a church, we have a policy, and I learned this from the late Pope Shenouda as I served with him for 6 years. We reject using the term diaspora because 90% of Coptic Christians still live in Egypt. And so the vast majority of Egyptian Christians are still there.
So you're not fearful of the long-term future of Christianity in Egypt?
Absolutely not. When you compare what's happening now to the reign of Diocletian or the entry of Islam into Egypt in the 7th century, this is quite small in comparison to those. And as Coptic Christians, as Christians in Egypt, we've outlived those. We'll most definitely outlive this.
You're listening to In Conversation. I'm Tim Ecott, and I've been talking to Bishop Angaelos from the Coptic Orthodox Church.